Hello and welcome. This once again is Pastor Ken Ortize as we continue our morning devotionals together. And currently we've been going through the epistle of 1 Peter. We are in the 3rd chapter, and the topic has been talking about the relationships of husbands and wives. What are the biblical guidelines that are laid out there? But before I get into that, of course, I want to display my t-shirt that I have for you. Now, if you look at the front of it, I'll probably have to stand up so you can see it. It holds this interesting statement. It says talentless. It's not a commentary on me particularly, but basically it's the brand name. But it's what's on the back that I wanted to put on display. If you can see this, and I hope I get covered, it says simply, "Let the Lord be with you." For those of you who felt like that turnaround was too quick, I encourage you to freeze frame it, and if you want to read it. But anyway, that's the t-shirt. My youngest son gave it to me, and I like the brand Talentless. They make really good quality t-shirts, but that's enough marketing for now. Darn, I'm not going to get a cut of that either. Anyway, it's been really pretty warm here in Spokane, and I just wanted to comment something briefly about it because I find a lot of people are saying, well, it's obviously an evidence of global warming because in their lifetime it's never been this hot before. Actually, I think we got up to 105 or 106 on one day a couple weeks ago, and it's been pretty much in the high 90s, high to mid 90s, but that's not terribly unusual for us in this part of the country. We get summers like this that are actually feel like summer, and there's those of us who are actually pretty excited and appreciated about it. Of course, that would include those of us who have air conditioning. If you don't, it's a torturous moment to go through. But nonetheless, actually, it was 60 years ago since we had temperatures that reached this high, which is kind of the normal cycle that things go through. So I would hardly say that this is a sign of global warming or unprecedented heating. It's just an unusually warm summer. And here's the bad news, or the worst news, if you will. Usually when we have really warm summers like this, we really have really cold, heavy winters. Kind of balances it out. So basically what we're seeing is climate change. We find that the climate changes month to month, year to year, decade to decade. And so that's nothing I think that people should get terribly upset about. Even when they talk about the strain on the water resources in a particular area, a lot of that has to do with people relocating in areas where there's not a lot of natural water resources, and or we build up to the point where we begin to drain those resources pretty heavily. And so as a consequence, we find that we use a lot more water than people did just 50 years ago. So all those things become factors, and yet for those who are in the elites, they like to hold this up as an example of why we should yield more of our freedoms and liberties and give them more power to control our lives, and which I think is sick and wrong, or as one of my granddaughters used to say, thick and long. But anyway, that's that. I'll move on to getting back to our topic at hand. If you were with us last week, you saw that I started talking about the relationships of husband and wife as Peter outlined it in the first 5 or 6 verses or 7 verses of chapter 3 of his letter. And basically, the reason why he and Paul both address this topic is because even in biblical times, this was a central issue, a source of a lot of conflict and difficulty. We have in our mind this idea that ancient people had these kind of, very wholesome relationships that never went through difficulty or conflict. The fact of the matter is that ever since Eve ate of that fruit in the garden, marriage relationships have faced difficulties. In fact, right out of the garden, they start blaming each other and pointing the finger at each other and creating the first marriage argument that we have in human history. And it hasn't stopped since then. Because one of the things that I think is really interesting is because first and foremost, we have to understand that the marriage relationship is the most humanly intimate relationship that we can possibly have. And because both people in a marriage are also sinners who have to be saved by grace in order to be able to remedy some of their behavioral characteristics, it becomes a naturally conflicted relationship. And part of the thing that has really added to confusion is this idea that's come in the last few decades that somehow men and women are essentially the same, that we think the same, we are basically, other than some various obvious external manifestations, are exactly the same being. All scientific research, all biological evidence, points to the fact that men and women are vastly different characters. And I often say, somewhat humorously, that other than the fact that we can procreate, we probably could be declared a separate species, because men don't think like women and women don't think like men, and that often is the source of conflict. It also is the basis, if it's used rightly, of complementing each other in a wonderful way, because if there's, as Paul and Peter both say, there needs to be mutual submission, which means there's a mutual respect for one another. The consequence is that we rely upon one another for perspectives and for counsel and guidance in areas where we're lacking. That men have a certain perspective that I think helps them to be sometimes too objective, and women have a perspective that helps them to get a hold of really the social, emotional, psychological dynamics of a moment. And we need to hear that from one another. We need to be able to be supportive in those differences, so that my wife feels things much more deeply and much more quickly than I do. I tend to be very analytical as a man, and therefore I tend to just say, give me the facts. All I'm concerned with is the facts. And the point is that when I say that, I'm overlooking the fact that emotions are part of the fact. If you don't factor in emotions and the dynamics of relationship, you're going to make maybe strong decisions, decisive decisions, but they also may be biased and unfair decisions. So the idea that men live in a complementary relationship with their wives and wives with their husbands is really something I think is really kind of taught within Scripture and suggested in the very things that Peter and Paul had to say about marriage relationships. What really, as I said, has made it difficult was the entrance of sin into human history. When God punishes Adam and Eve, it's interesting that they're given different punishments. He tells the man, you're going to make your living by the sweat of your brow, and I have not found anything that contradicts that to this day. In fact, I find some people who try to avoid working, and they have more sweat on their brow than people who actually do the work. And so we understand that we have to go out and do work in order to be productive. Before sin entered in the world, the earth was productive because it wasn't hindered by the stain of sin. But man has to work. On the other side, he says to the woman that your desire will be to your husband, and he will rule over you. And that's really become quite a rub, because oftentimes men have used that to lord it over their wives. I mean, they've taken on a very authoritarian type of view of the relationship. And there's a little wordplay that I think is important to distinguish. The word authoritarian and the word authoritative are really not exactly the same. An authoritarian is somebody who says, I'm in control, I'm the boss, everybody does what I said. Authoritative means that we speak from a position of responsibility. So one means power, the other means responsibility. And I believe that God has given this division in the home, that God has given a certain kind of power to men that they might provide, protect, and take care of their families. And women, on the other hand, have been given a certain power or authority that they might be those who create a stability and a consistency emotionally in caring for the welfare of the family unit. And really, it comes down to the fact that we, in our basic, most intimate desires, are looking for something quite different. You see, women really desire an unwavering love from their husband. They want to know that when he says, I do at the altar, that that's going to be something he will do all the days of his life until death do them part. She needs to have that commitment before she can ever feel herself safe under his leadership. That if I'm serving somebody who is committed to my welfare and will lay down their very life for my welfare, then I find it easy to trust them. But when they become, there's an instability like we have in the relationships of marriage today, where men come and go, and in fact, many men prefer not to even actually commit to marriage because they don't want to be committed. If it becomes unpleasant to them, they want to be able to pack up and move on, which is always easier for a man to do in our culture because we don't hold them responsible for the welfare of their wives or children as much. And so we find today that the divorce rate has kind of leveled off at about 45%, but not because people are becoming more successful in marriage, but rather because many of them are choosing simply not to get married in the first place. The idea of cohabitating. And usually in 99% of the cases, it's the woman who is the big loser in the cohabitation decision. So women, what they're looking for is that unwavering love that, he's going to be there until death do part. What men are looking for is really kind of an unwavering respect. Most men know that they are out of their depth. And we often think about how great it would be to be a person in charge and to have power. You only think that until you're in that position and you realize with that power and that position comes a great deal of responsibility. And that responsibility is there because there's so many ways in which you can make mistakes and you can get it wrong. And there's kind of this vicious learning curve that every man has to go through in his life. And I think it's important for women to realize that your husband lives in a pretty adversarial world. The workplace out there can be often a very vicious place, a very basically, what have you done for me lately? And oftentimes men are measured by what they haven't done or haven't accomplished. Very often they do, or rarely do they get the kind of kudos and encouragement and respect in the marketplace that we desperately need. And so it's natural for them to look to the marriage relationship as a place where their wife would show them respect. That's why Paul, in writing to the Ephesians in chapter 5, put it this way. He said, husbands, love your wives. And then he says, wives, respect your husbands. Now, before he told them to do that, he said, love one another, submit to one another in Christ. How does a wife submit to her husband? By endeavoring to respect his position, his responsibility, his authority at the head of his house. And how does a man love his wife? By being willing to serve her and use whatever authority and power he has to make sure that her needs are met and those of your children. Well, again, I'm out of time, but I'll pick this up tomorrow because this is a topic that I think that most people, both married and unmarried, are really wrestling with, and I hope I can give some insight to that. God bless. We'll pick it up tomorrow.